Makonnen Sankofa is the author of the best-selling book, The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation, and also the author of Life in Gambia, all of which I've left a link in the description part of this interviews for viewers who would like to get a copy from Amazon. There is much to know about Mr. Makonnen Sankofa, ranging from being a journalist to an entrepreneur, an educator, public speaker, community activist, etc. But get to know him better as we proceed in the interview. Welcome on the show, Makonnen.
Thank you very much, Peter, for having me. It's great to be on the show with you today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Likewise.
Now, Makonnen, another critical themes that you expound in your book is the transatlantic slave trade, which can be found in page 14 of The Rise of Rastafari, where you wrote about how millions of Black Africans were kidnapped in the west coast of Africa by white Europeans, and how they were sold into slavery. I want to have your opinion about this. What connection do you think the transatlantic slave trade have over the dispersion of the Black community around the world today? How does this connect with Africans in diaspora? Would you say that the old slave trade is what led to what we have today as Black Americans and many other Black people found around Europe and other parts of the world?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is largely to do with it because, there are two things. Obviously, you have the dispersion of Africans because of slavery, transatlantic slave trade. As we know, slaves were descendants. No, let me say that again. Enslaved Africans. I don't like saying African slaves because they were enslaved Africans. Yeah, and I think that's something that is very important that we say. So, enslaved Africans were taken from, parts of West Africa and sometimes Central Africa, like the Congo, but generally it's parts of West Africa, like Ghana, Nigeria, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, and other countries along the west coast of Africa, and then transported to places such as the Caribbean and the Americas, like USA, Brazil, etc. So that has led to the dispersion of Africans from the continent, because obviously when they've then gone to those countries, they've then had children, and that's led to the population of more Africans, and a lot of them have stayed in those countries for generations, and not necessarily come back. So that has led to why you have Africans all over the world. In terms of in Europe now, the reason why you have a large concentration of Africans in Europe, such as UK and other parts of Europe as well, but particularly UK, let me focus on England. Like my grandparents' generation, they immigrated from Jamaica, and then they went from Jamaica to the Caribbean. So in 1948, you had a mass migration of people of African heritage that was living in the Caribbean, Commonwealth countries, to come to Britain to help build up the country because of the World War II, which happened, and Britain was in a very bad state because of World War II that happened. So these people from the Caribbean, these Africans in the Caribbean, were invited to come to Britain by Queen Elizabeth, and so many of them took the opportunity to come up because conditions. Living conditions in the Caribbean wasn't very good after slavery ended. The people were left kind of like with no compensation. Unlike the British slave holders, they were like, it was just basically, it's like you free a man, but you don't, because you don't give him anything for him to fend for himself or for him to survive. So they were just basically freed, but with no compensation. And then after that, into the colonial years, the environment and the condition of Jamaica, there wasn't a lot of opportunities and things to really for people to make the ends meet, for example, was very challenging, difficult. So a lot of people coming to Britain as England, particularly England, they thought it was, the streets are paved with gold, and that had been propaganda had been played, and they came with high inspirations and thinking that, for a better life, that they would be able to, do better in England than they were previously back home in the Caribbean. So a lot of them between 1948 up until like 1970, there's a mass migration of people from the Caribbean islands. But I use Jamaica because that's where my grandparents came from, that came to the UK. So that's why you have a heavily concentration of, people of Caribbean heritage in the UK. But then some of them also went to the United States. The United States had, enslaved Africans that were directly there taken from the continent. But then you also had some of them that came from like the Caribbean, like particularly Jamaica. Some of them came from Jamaica. Like my grandparents, some of us came to the UK, some of the family, but some of the other side of the family went to the United States. So it was like a mixture. So I've got family in USA and UK split, just like Canada as well. You have like a lot of Jamaican people in Canada, so some of them went to Canada. I've got family in Canada as well, so that's why you have like black people dispersing up in along the world. And then you have also the Africans now on the continent, which has been more in recent times, particularly like say in the UK, for example. I think it was more like in the 80s and the 90s, and now you're having more of an influx of people on the continent coming, to the UK, which makes up now the majority of more so than, ones from the Caribbean, because most of the Africans now that are coming to the UK are coming directly from the continent. So, and Africans on the continent as well, going to other parts of Europe, America, and etc. So, those are the reasons why you have the dispersion. So the transatlantic slave trade has played a heavy role in, a lot of the dispersion of people of African heritage. But you also have now a growing influx of people from the continent that are relocating to all other parts of the world.
Wow, that's quite great, because I realize and find out that a lot of people have a sort of a misconception about this, not trying to identify if most Black people are from the African heritage or from Africa generally. Now, I'd also love to ask you this question, because in your book, I read about the brutal experience that most African slaves undergone during the transatlantic slave trade. You wrote about how many people died on the ship due to bad condition, and how some women were raped by their masters, how many committed suicide by throwing themselves off the boat into the sea, and how many Africans who tried to fight back and defend themselves were killed, among several other gruesome experiences that the Black undergone in the hands of their cruel masters. Could you tell us more about these and how these incidents gruesomely influenced the Rastafarian and other Africans?
Well, how it influenced, like the Rastafari and other Africans, is that the legacy that the transatlantic slave trade has left, in terms of after slavery ended, it wasn't like, slavery all of a sudden ended and then that's it, for example. There's still been, mental slavery and inferiority. And even in the societies afterwards, you had societies which were heavily racist towards Black people, whether in the Caribbean, in the United States of America. And, it kind of laid the framework for a lot of racism that happened then after that, for example. And even though, the shackles were taken off, so to speak, and et cetera, but there was still heavy slavery that existed. So it was like, the mental slavery was still there as well in the people, in terms of, the minds, because during slavery, people have been, effectively like washed away from their Africanness, basically Europeanized. They're given, new European names. Their culture had been stripped of them. The language they talk, instead of the African language, Europeanized language. So all of these are part of the legacy of slavery. And the way we look at Africa, until this day, people still look at Africa, a lot of people from the Caribbean, in a very negative way. And a lot of this kind of stems from slavery, and down to even like the family structures that we still struggle with today, particularly people of Caribbean heritage. In the past during slavery, that it was like the female that was very kind of elevated amongst the male. And it's like the the male was always basically, the black male, for example, was put down. And this is why you have incidences like butt breaking, you know what, where effectively a man was raped in front of his own family, yeah, and how, you know, certain things, the woman was elevated above the man, and that kind of thing has influenced, you know, a lot of families today. So there's various, and I think, things in the minds of our people. Again, you talk about spirituality, you could say about how, you know, what the kind of spirituality that our people have, you know, the kind of Europeanized version of the Christianity that a lot of people that have still carried over from slavery. So these are some of the ways that, you know, the legacy has affected us today, and why the Rasta movement and Africans in general, but also the Rasta movement, because, you know, I said the Rasta movement is about, you know, freeing the minds of mental slavery, and from transatlantic slave trade, coming out of that, our people were not in the right place in terms of their mind and what they thought of, you know what, they had an inferiority complex because that had been, you know, taught into them, and they had no choice because the brutality of what they were going through. So this is like how the transatlantic slave trade is, you know, has influenced African people as a whole, and, you know, the Rastafari movement have tried to really, as much as possible, to raise the, you know, the consciousness levels and get our people to be proud to say that we've got a history beyond slavery, because in slavery they didn't want you to learn about anything, you know, African history or part of your culture, whatever. That was all basically thrown away. So these are some of the areas that I've mentioned. But in terms of the brutality, now, slave, obviously, life was dreadful, was terrible. You know, enslaved Africans taken from the west coast of Africa and then brought to places like the Caribbeans and Americans. And they had a very hard life from the onset. I mean, from being captured to then being put on, you know, these ships with little room to move, chains next to each other, and they took, you know, enslaved Africans, sometimes from different African countries, and sometimes they couldn't communicate with languages. But then, you know, the horrendous. I mean, imagine being obviously on a slave ship with pretty little room to move for pretty much the whole day. You know what, in those kind of conditions. That's why a lot of people threw themselves off of the ship. People tried to revolt. You know, some people were killed in the revolts. I think Amistad was one of the popular revolts, but there was a lot of, you know, people that didn't revolt, or people that threw themselves off the ships because of it. And to go through that, being put in like, you know, at the bottom of a ship deck in a kind of like for some of them for months. In inhumane conditions. And we've got even before that, we could talk about the dungeons, the slave dungeons that existed, they call slave fortresses in like Ghana. If you go like Amina Castle and other castles in Ghana, and, you know, you look at these dungeons and these places that they held slaves for sometimes up to periods of 1 year, yeah, in these kind of conditions. And I'm in Gambia, the Life in Gambia. My book is called Life in Gambia, the Smiling Coast of Africa. This is the home of Kunta Kinte. I mean, everyone's familiar with the TV series Roots. And I've been to Jufre in Alfreda, like the home of Kunta Kinte, where his village was when he was captured, and then where he was taken away, which is called James Island. Now it's called Kunta Kinte Island. And to see that, you know, someone that they used to just you know, hang people up, well, basically put people up, tie people up into that kind of area, that they would be there for such long extended periods of time. And it's really barbaric. And this is just, you know, the first part of it. This is just, you know, the journey going to the destination. And then, you know, when they get to the destination, you know what, they brandishing with irons, had to not produce, had to work on producing on the cotton plantations, producing products such as sugarcane, and things like that. And if, you know, sometimes if they couldn't collect enough quota, for example, they could be beaten, they could be whipped by their masters, or for any reason that the slave master felt fit. You know, scientific experiments were done on certain African heritage women without getting any anesthetics and stuff like that. People that tried to resist slavery, for example, were killed, some burnt alive, and all kinds of atrocities. Women were raped, for example, even if they were married or whatever. They had no choice. One of the master could just take a slave wife and do what he wants to do with the wife. So people being kept, in shackles and chains, yeah. and it's horrific. It's such a sad thing to think that a group of people can do that, such pain on another group of people for such, and something like that can go on for such a long time. Is just it's very, very hard to swallow that.
Wow, it's terrible. You know, when I actually read about the section of your book, it actually pulled me in, and I was like, wow, this is quite, intriguing, and I was going to ask him about this. Now, I'd love to move into my other question. From reading your book, I see that you are an advocate of justice towards the way the Black people are being treated outside Africa. Talk about the racism, the discrimination, the segregation, degradation, and several other inhumane acts. Despite the ongoing condition of the Black people around some part of the world, it is a shocking reality that most people who still reside in Africa are desperately yearning in pursuit of a good life in Europe, just as we've seen during the illegal crossing over of some Africans to Europe on the Mediterranean Sea. As a Black activist, what do you have to say about this adventurous journey of the Blacks? What imagery do you think this portrays of Africa by the white community?
Well, it doesn't portray a good image of Africa. It portrays the image that, people will think, well, why if they're crossing over, they must be crossing over because things are better in the land that they're crossing to. That's what the kind of assumption that people would jump to straight away. Because why would you be moving from one place to other place unless you possibly think you're gonna have a better life, or no one goes to another country or somewhere else unless they're gonna think things are necessarily going to be better for them, unless they're running away from something, etc. But in general, you're moving from one place to another place for a better way of life. And I think a lot of those people that go in the back way, that's why they are trying to go through the back way, because they believe, not necessarily it's true, but they believe that a better life is in Europe and the Western world. And unfortunately, the way Africa how it is in today is a lot of, as we know, the natural resources have been exploited. Colonialism had a heavy effect on the continent, and it's changed. Basically, effectively, it's made the continent where it is today. It's kept the continent reliant. So sometimes when people look at Africa and they're saying, well, how comes Africa's not prospering, this, that, and that? But you have to understand that the effects that colonialism has had on the continent, and in the minds of our people as well, for example, in the sense of, we can't do for self. We always have to look towards Europe and the West as the best, and the fact is that's the kind of impact that it's had. And on an example on the ground now, not just in the minds, but in terms of I think there's about 14 francophone countries in Africa, and they're all paying still, money to the French government for being colonized. It's called colonial debt. I mean, the French went in. The French were not the only, because we know England, Belgium, other countries did. But I'm using this as an example because a lot of people don't know this. But the French colonized Africa, countries like Togo, Senegal, francophone speaking countries. That was colonized, and Guinea-Bissau, Burkina Faso, and they effectively said that when they was going to leave, that they so-called believed that they made improvements on these countries by colonialism and building infrastructure. And they said that if we're going to leave, we're going to mess up all the infrastructure in the country unless these taxes unless money is paid to us. So you have a result where African countries, Francophone countries, are paying billions amount of 500 billion every single year goes into the central bank. And this is the things, and African leaders that have tried to rise up against this and say, no, we're not doing this is wrong. Yeah, I think there was an example of one country where the country was completely turned apart when basically by the French, when they said, no, we're not going to do this. And other instances, those leaders have been assassinated, basically, that haven't basically said that, we're going to do away with this colonial tax. So when people ask, and people say, why is Africa and why are people going abroad or whatever, people don't understand the kind of things that are done by the Western world to keep Africa in the state they're in. And this is a colonial tax, is the prime example. 500 billion you know what, a year going to, you know, in a central franc bank, what that does, you know, we need to understand how that affects the economies of those countries from developing. And so the fact is that and they only have a certain budget that they can spend as well. If they want to get more money, they've got to go to the French to get more money, and then they've got to pay back high interest loans. So these are the kind of things like resources and military. They still existing in neocolonialism. They've got like allegiance to the France, yeah. So for, you know, if they're going to do like trade contracts, etc. So when you exist in that kind of colonial state, it keeps you at a certain level. When we've had African leaders, yeah, strong, that have tried to, and this is outside of francophone countries now in general, when you've had strong African leaders that have tried to rise up, yeah, look at what has happened to them. We could talk about, we're talking about the questionality of these leaders, because some people will say, well, yes, and whether they're not or not. But I'm saying to you, you could say Gaddafi, you could say Nkrumah, you could say Mugabe, you could say Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba. There's a list of African leaders, but when they have tried to do things for the continent, yeah, for our people, to advance our people, yeah, look what has been put against them. Oftentimes they've been assassinated or they've been attacked in some kind of way. And these are the things that have kept the continent from progressing. Yeah, look at, you know, Honorable Robert Mugabe. Yeah, as soon as he basically said that, you know what, in Zimbabwe that it was going to allow the black people to take back the land, all of a sudden these sanctions are placed on Zimbabwe. Yeah, for example, which affected the economy of the country. Yeah, but and sometimes, because our people on the continent are not always fully sometimes educated on, you know, global affairs and world affairs, they just see things, you know, why is it that, you know what, all of a sudden, you know, it's their problem, you know, because they treat the white people off the farm, you know, these people in Africa don't know what they're doing, but they're not understanding how, you know what, how basically Zimbabweans, in terms of doing trade, in terms of how all the sanctions basically affected that country. The fact that, for example, their credit was frozen. Can you imagine, you know, if America is a country that runs off of credit, imagine if America, you know, had credit frozen. Imagine if America couldn't trade with certain countries. So we need to understand, but there's a lot done. IMF loans and money from the World Bank that come with stipulation, these NGOs going into Africa. And these are all the kind of issues that make Africa where it is today, and the problem. So Africa is still in a colonial state. It's in a neo-colonial state where, you know what, the colonizers have left the continent, but, you know, they've left things in places where it's still working for them. It's still working for Europe. It's still working for the West. And then they put in a lot of puppet leaders that do the bidding for them. And then when you have a leader that tries to rise above it and do for their own people, they often get taken out.
Wow.
So that makes, but the average person trying to, you know what, thinking about survival, the average African on the ground, and I'm in Gambia, is just thinking, what about African leaders? Why comes we can't do this, that, and the other? But Europe looks nice because I've got family and I see on TV, it looks nice and it looks like all of this. And when they come over there on holiday, it looks all nice. But they're not seeing the, you know, the reason why Africa is in the condition today because of Europeans. But they have more of a in anything more of a thankful mind. And I see the way that they treat a lot of African countries, how they treat white people in African countries. So it's almost like not seeing that, you know what, the resources and everything has been ripped and exploited out of Africa to make Europe what it is. But the average everyday African doesn't have that kind of access to information, or is not necessarily educated on, you know, what the problems that Africa exists. So, but naturally, if you're in a country of survival and there is opportunities, and I'm not saying things are not all rosy. There is. I'm in the Gambia. Yeah, there is some levels of poverty here, and you have poverty in everywhere in every country in the world. And I get the logical thing is then, you know, you want to move to somewhere where you think it's in a better environment. So I get that. Not necessarily saying going the back way is not the right way to go about it, but I get that. But we also, but I'm just want to respond and say this is the, you know, the mindset of why a lot of people that are, you know, are aspiring to Europe, because they see Europe as the streets are paved with gold, and they have that this image of, through the Western media, which is portrayed of Africa, and they show Africa in a negative light, and people unfortunately believe that.
Yeah, I love your deep and extensive, you know, answer to that question. Thank you for adding that in. Now, as a Pan-Africanist and a writer, I'd love to have your opinion on this. It is obvious that some African countries are lacking behind in terms of political stability and right government. As a writer who is passionate about the condition of the Black people in diaspora and all, what role do you think that writers have to play towards the unification of a country that is imminently tearing apart?
Okay, so I think that's quite a broad question. So I think that would depend on the country and what specifically is going on in the country. If I'm honest, before I could really say, because you would need to know more of what's actually happening on the ground before you could say maybe how authorship could influence a unification of a country. I think authorship, though, can certainly help in terms of educating people, but I don't necessarily know whether how that leads to unification, because it depends on what's going on in that country.
Okay, I'll take that from you. Thanks for that. Now, you also wrote about the iconic man, Marcus Garvey. Tell us about him and what impact do you think he has made in the Black community?
Well, Marcus Garvey, he had an organization called Universal, which still exists today, but it was more popular, around, say, like the 1920s, for example, and the early part of the 19th century. The early part of the 20th century. Marcus Garvey's organization called Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, which was the biggest race first organization. And Marcus Garvey's motto was "Up you mighty race, you can accomplish whatever you will." And Marcus Garvey's organization, they had hotels, restaurants, businesses like steam laundry shops, newspapers. He had his own press printing company, the Negro World newspaper, which is a weekly publication. And he was an advocate that Black people, we need to, build a nation. Nation building was at the foundation of Marcus Garvey's teachings, and he was adamant that we needed to do that based on the context of the time and the need for Black people to be self-sufficient and not to rely on people of another race or ethnicity to govern our own destinies. He was saying that we need to be the ones that are in control of our livelihood, in control of our businesses, in control of our politics, in control of our spirituality, in control of all aspects of our life. And Marcus Garvey was an advocate of repatriation. He had the Black Star Line with intention to take Black people back to Africa. And that was what effectively they were planning towards. Now, things came in place and Garvey he was actually planning to go to Liberia. Things happened and the US government stopped that. And when he was in USA, he got imported to Jamaica. But Marcus Garvey was born in St. Anne's in Jamaica. He's actually one of Jamaica's first national hero. But his impact is global, not just in Jamaica, but in the USA, in Africa, Malawi, where my dad is from. The flag of Malawi is in Marcus Garvey's colors. The flag of Malawi was inspired by Garvey. A lot of the African leaders were inspired by Garvey. I've heard Robert Mugabe compliment Marcus Garvey. Yeah. Kwame Nkrumah, he said out of all the books he read, I think it was the Philosophies and Opinions of Marcus Garvey and Garvey's teachings that inspired him the most. Yeah. And the influence of Garvey extends to the diaspora, but also continent. Even though Garvey's main target audience was Black people in the diaspora, but the impact of Garvey also goes onto the continent. And Marcus Garvey was of the 20th century, he's probably the most eminent leader. He certainly had the book in the UNIA of all Black organizations. They had the biggest following. They had millions of people from, in Europe, in the Caribbean, in the Americas. That was a massive organization and a prime example of Black people doing for self. So the works of Marcus Garvey still lives on to this day, and the legacy is still inspiring people. And Marcus Garvey, a lot of movements such as the Rasta movement or even the Nation of Islam and other movements, that have been inspired by Garvey's teachings of Pan-Africanism, of unity, of self-reliance of the Black race and nation building. So that's just some information there about the Honourable Marcus Garvey.
Yeah, that's great. That's great because when I actually read about Marcus Garvey in the book, I think I've heard about him in time past, but I don't really know much about him. So while I read about him in the Rise of Rastafari, I took my time again and make some sort of an extensive research on him, and it's also fun to your opinion of him from you. Now, there is a point that you made in your book, which I found very contemplative and debateful, which is a part in page 23 of the Rise of Rastafari, where you wrote that during slavery, the black slaves became Christian because Christianity was imposed on them by their slave masters. He wrote of how the blacks were made to submit to servitude by the influence of some biblical passages as seen in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 44 to 46, and in Ephesians 6, verse 9, verse 5 rather, and in Timothy chapter 6, verse 1 and 2, etc. You know, tell us, are you trying to preach the notion that Christianity among the black community today is a product of slavery?
The way we look at, in a sense, it is in terms of the way we Christianity came onto us in a lot of people. When I say us, not be necessarily Africans on the continent, even though Christianity didn't come across, is not practiced the way it was centuries ago, and it came as the way it did through colonization and ministers going onto the continent. But I'm talking about there's a difference between that and how it came, to those in like the Caribbean and America, the descendants of enslaved Africans. But in terms of, it is in a sense because of how it was used, by white people, just like how they stripped black people, off their languages. Like you say, in roots, it's called Kunta Kinte, and he named him Toby, and these kind of things, and the language, for example, and the culture, and the history, wrote them on the history and these kind of things. So Christianity was something that was used as a tool because it was the white masters, it was their religion, and they felt fit to put their own spirituality on the enslaved Africans, because the enslaved Africans weren't Christians. They were turned into Christians because they were, well, they had no choice, many of them, but to take on the religion of their master, and the Bible and that kind of thing was the only kind of things they had. And it was like pastors that would come and see slave masters, etc. And when you look at, that's why when you look at, say, even all of the kind of slavery films or whatever, where it's 12 years of slaves and all, and a lot of the films, I can't even name them all, but there's a lot of slavery films. You see a lot of Bible verses quoted in there, for example. So it's not something I'm just saying or making up. So the Bible was used to keep slaves, the African people submissive, and there's quotes in the Bible that was used, such as Timothy 6:1, all who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name in our teaching may not be slandered. Timothy 6.2, those who have believing masters
should not show them
their worth. They should serve them, dear to them as fellow believers, and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves. Ephesians 6.5, slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Exodus 21:20 to 21, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave, but if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. And lastly, Titus 2.9, slaves are to be submissive to their own masters in everything. They are to be well-pleasing, not argumentative. Now, these are some of the quotes that and these was used, and also the fact that it was used to justify slavery by people saying no. Outside of slavery, that's even in apartheid in South Africa, when the Dutch Reformed Church supported the apartheid and said that, and used quotes in the Bible to justify it, and all of and other areas. But we're talking about transatlantic slavery now. But these are some these are quotes, and these are basically the reasons why, and parts why, for example, I say that the Bible was imposed on Africans, and to keep them from revolting and resisting against. Against oppressions, because basically, if you look at quotes like these, then you're saying that, oh yeah, but there's a justified, or God would deal with it, or, you know, so it was to justify what the slave masters believed were Black people, African people's positions on earth. And that's why you don't have to agree with, you know, that fact, but that's how it was used at that period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I love that last sentence. You don't have to agree with it, but that was how it was used at that time to capture their heart. Well, thank you so much, Makonnen Sankofa, for talking about your book and about the transatlantic slave trade. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you very much for having me.